Okay, Motorola. There's been various articles in the press, amateur radio press, about repurposing PMR radios, particularly Pi in the older days, burn depths for 2 meters and 70 centimeters, but I've never seen anything on Motorola. And I thought it was about time somebody did that, because these are starting to appear in large numbers on eBay. The main users of these radios were the taxi cabs, and of course they're all going over to
AutoCab.
Yeah, app-based navigation and dispatching. So these radios are popping up at silly prices on eBay, so they're well worth a look.
Publish an article in Radical, let us all buy some.
So it's the Motorola's. The other ones you'll see at silly prices that were from taxi cabs were Auriga, which are badged tape radios. So they're also very good for 2 and 70. I'm just going to focus on Motorola tonight because that's what I know most about. Just briefly a bit of history of Motorola. The company was founded in 1928 by a couple of brothers who decided to go into business manufacturing adapters for what were then battery radios, so people could use them on the new mains electricity. 1928, remember. By 1930 they'd actually started manufacturing car radios, and their first car radio was a 6-valve AM only radio. So that's all there was in those days. FM didn't come about to the 40s, which actually cost about $130, and the full Model A at the time cost $540. So the radio was like 25% of the cost of the car. You'll also notice in the installation instructions it didn't work from the car battery. It ran from its own low tension and high tension batteries, which is stuffed under the seats. Just in case that seems like an awful lot of trouble though, remember up until then, if you wanted to listen to music in your car, you had to do something like that. Who remembers that film? So moving on 10 years, Motorola introduced the first true handheld walkie-talkie, the SCR 536. Have you got one of those, Martin?
I haven't got one because they go for a hell of a lot of money these days.
Right, okay.
Oh, God, yeah, hell of a lot.
350 milliwatts of AM on a single crystal controlled channel. 130,000 of them were made, so you've really got an excuse, Martin. There must be some out there. Anybody recognise that guy?
Looks like Tom Hanks.
Yeah. It is Tom Hanks. He did actually use an SCR 536 in Saving Private Ryan. So yeah, that was another one of their radios. Later on, moving 20-30 years forward, they provided most of the radio systems used for the Apollo series of moonshots, or the Apollo space program. And in fact, Neil Armstrong's words, "One small step for man," were relayed on an S-band Motorola multiplex radio system that used 2.1 gigs from the Earth to the spacecraft and 2.2 gigs back. It's a full duplex link, and then they had that carried 3 full duplex voice channels, which were then relayed to the spacesuits using Motorola VHF radios. Didn't always go down very well with the locals though.
Somebody actually heard that VHF one to link from the moon.
Yeah, I think they were very low power. You were more likely to be able to hear the 2.2 gigs downlink than the VHF. As I say, it didn't really go down very well with the locals though.
Yes.
Motorola also introduced a number of what were then groundbreaking microprocessors. The MC6800 came in the early 70s. What did people use microprocessors for in the 70s? Well, things like, this was a point of sale terminal from TRW. This was some automated test equipment from Hewlett Packard for analog data links. And this device was a card access system for hotels and factories. So that's the sort of things that those early microprocessors went into. David, I'm sure, will recognise the thing on the right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that had a 68,000, which was Motorola's first 32-bit microprocessor. That's a Sun Spark workstation.
Those are competing with 6502s in those days.
Well, the 6502 was actually based on the 6800 architecture. It wasn't the same manufacturer, of course, but it was based on the architecture of the 6800. They also got into datacomms. They had the first 19.2 kilobit 4-wire landline modem, and I can remember working on those when I worked for CETA in the early 80s. They had the first dial-up 28.8 kilobit modem. That was a 2-wire modem, and they also made a range of frame relay switches for voice and data, all of which is very obsolete now, of course, with IP, but they were groundbreaking in those days in the early 80s. They also made handheld computers with barcode scanners. Here you see a courier, so he can track the parcels from the shipper right through to the delivery. They also produced the first analog commercial cellular phone, the Dynatac 8000. Their semiconductor businesses were spun off twice, in fact, on Semiconductor and then Freescale. And what remained of the company, so the Motorola Mobility, the handheld computers, the barcode scanners, that was bought by Google and then subsequently Lenovo. So you won't see those anymore. All that's left now is Motorola Solutions, which are still making mainly digital land mobile radio systems, Tetra and P25 primarily for the police and emergency services. So not a great story, I'm afraid. They've gone from 150,000 employees at their peak in the 90s, and now they're just down to 20,000 employees. That was their headquarters in Schaumburg back in the heyday, and that's it being demolished a couple of years ago.
So most of their mobile phones are now badged to somebody else's.
Yeah, so
it's still Motorola. This is a Motorola, but it does say powered by Lenovo when you put
there you go. Yeah. So they've really just bought the name.
Yeah.
It's a bit like Wilco. You'll continue to see the Wilco name, but it'll be the range behind it. How did I get into using Motorola radios? I used to work for Codan, an Australian company that made HF radios, and we had a product called the 3031 Crosspatch, which allowed you to interconnect a VHF radio and an HF radio in a vehicle, so you could go walkabout and make an HF radio call with your handheld. That was the device there. The way it worked was if you did a couple of clicks on the PTT, it would get the HF radio to make a selective call back to base. Inbound, if it received an inbound selective call, it would key up the VHF radio and it would send something like a telephone ringing tone. So you could get a second of ringing tone, and then it would drop carrier, and then it would do the same again until you hit the PTT, and that would return the cell call and establish the link. So then this was like the microphone on the HF radio. So a really clever little device. So that's how I started playing with Motorola radios, because we had a GM340 and a GP360, the mobile and the handheld, at the office for demoing this stuff. So moving on, mobile radios. These are the ones that you'll find most of on eBay these days, the GM350, and it's the one I really like. There's a few of them here. They're available for the VHF low band, which of course work for 4 meters, VHF high band, it's good for 2 meters, and UHF is good for 70 centimeters. So there's 3 different bands available, and there are 2 versions. There's a 128 channel with this 3-digit display. You can see a couple of them here. That one's on 4 meters, that one's on 2 meters. And there's another one that's only got 4 channels. That's this device here. So that's also a GM350, but you'll notice the front panel's entirely different. I'll pass it around actually, so you can get the camera on it when I pass it around. You'll notice on this one I've stuck a label on, and that's got some packet radio frequencies in. So for the high band one, that's probably all it's useful for, with only 4 channels on 2 meters, is for packet radio. I'll pass that around. There we go. 5 to 25 watts out, programmable. CTCSS for repeaters, on receive and transmit if you want. And as I said there, you've got the two different versions, 128 channels with a scan function and a 3-digit display, and the 4-channel which didn't have a display. You just got the 4 channel buttons at the bottom. How do you use a 3-digit display to do something useful? Well, this is what I came up with. So on my 4-meter one, very easy, you just need to use the 3 digits for the least significant digits of the frequency. So for example 300 is 70.3, 312 is 70.3125 and so on. 2 meters, likewise, very easy to do. And of course we've got 128 channels to play with, so we can also do clever things with the repeater channels. So the way I do it is using the new RV channel designations, RV48 for example. We use 48 and then the last digit, we only use 10 different CTCSS tones in the UK, so we can use the last digit to represent those. So for example 549 would be RV54 with 118.8 CTCSS, which is of course the Reading repeater. 70SEMS likewise, there's only really 8 simplex channels on 70SEMS, and that's SU16 to 23. So we can represent those with the 433 point frequency. And we can do the same sort of idea with the repeater channels. I haven't yet figured out what to do with the 7.6 split channels, but I'll figure that out one day.
A lot of those are digital.
Yeah.
A lot of those.
Mostly are, yeah, that's true. There's GB3NS is still analog, and that's the 7.6 meg split. It's in Banstead, and that actually puts a good signal in round here. So that's a GM350. You'll see these on eBay all the time. So for 4 meters, you can use either the 4-channel or the 128 channel version, of course, because you only really need 4 channels on 4 meters. 425, 400, 425, 450 and 475, that's all you probably need on 4 meters. I try and avoid them on 2 meters or 70SEMS unless you're into packet radio. You really want to be looking for the 128 channel versions, but you'll see them going from between 20 to 50 pounds on eBay, so they're worth a look. The GM340 is what superseded the 4-channel version of the GM350. I don't have one here, I'm afraid. I've never seen one on low band, I've only ever seen high band and UHF, so again, probably not of too much interest unless you want one for packet radio. What are you going to do with 4 channels on 2 or 70? It's not really enough, is it? But yeah, that's what they do. So VHF high, UHF, again 5 to 25 watts output. Then came the GM360 and the GM380, and these were what replaced the 128 channel versions of the GM350. And you can see in this box here, that's a GM360, and this one's on 2 meters. And that's got a 14-digit programmable display. You can program what's in here on a per channel basis. For example, this is showing the frequency and the channel number, V40. Well, for those of us who are old enough to remember S20. So that's the GM360 or GM380. These are interesting. You can actually program each channel for either 12.5 or 25 kilohertz channel spacing. So that would adjust the receive filter and the deviation on a per channel basis. I prefer 25 kilohertz, it gives better quality audio, of course. All of these mobile radios use the same DC cables. Have I got one? Yes, I have. I'll pass that around. Very simple. Very simple sort of connector, readily available on eBay. And for base station operations, you'll see these power supplies. I'll pass this one around as well. Actually, I won't, it's probably too heavy. But it's a 10 amp AC power supply, again badged Motorola, probably made in China actually, but it's badge Motorola at least.
Probably got a chip in it reporting everything you say.
It's recording us now with voice recognition. Okay, that's the I don't know where they get these part numbers from, but that's a GPN 6145A. You'll notice, as well as having the output is on that connector, you can also connect a car battery to this set of connectors, so it will float charge a car battery as well. So if the AC fails, the radio starts running from the car battery. There's also this device. Who remembers SMC from the good old days? They were a Yaesu dealer back in the 80s down in Southampton. They're still in business, but they're only focusing on business radio now. I know it says Hytera. I couldn't find the Motorola version of the advert, but that is this device here. So what's inside here, apart from the radio? I should have bought a screwdriver so I could show you actually, but there's plenty of metal. Okay. So you'll notice it's switched on, but there's no power connection. So there's a switch mode power supply in there, and a 7 amp hour lead acid battery, like the ones you get in burglar alarms. So that's in there as well. So that will give you a few hours autonomy if the AC fails. And very helpfully, they put an N-type connector on the back, because most Motorola radios, as you'll see if you look around the back, have BNC connectors. So that's the SMC FP1 base station adapter. I think the last time I came onto the Club Net I was using this, if anybody's interested. So yeah, you could fit in the GM340, GM360 and GM380 into these. Actually the GM350 will fit, but you get gaps because the front panel isn't quite the same shape, but it does at least fit in there. Yes, as it says there, there's even a little meter on there to show you the state of the battery, which is still in the green at the moment, so we've got a good battery. They also made this rather useless device, a plinth. I'll pass that around. That was available with the option of a built-in speaker. That one doesn't have the built-in speaker. It's really just to hold the radio at a convenient angle. Probably charged a fortune for something that cost about 30p to make out of the plastic. Something you could probably 3D print these days as well. So yeah, that is the base station operation. They also made a repeater, the GR500 series repeater, which was 2 radios, and I've seen them with a variety of different radios in them. I actually bought one of these at the Luton Rally a few years back, which had a couple of the 128 channel GM350 high bands in. 2 mobile radios, power supply. That's a Motorola repeater controller, and if you can just about see that there, that's a Procom duplexer, so there's room to build the duplexer in as well if you wanted to run it on a single antenna. All housed in a 19-inch cabinet, and you had the option of sticking the ears on to put it on in a 19-inch cabinet as well.
So a rebroadcaster type repeater.
Yeah, so there was one of these would be the receiver, one would be the transmitter, and the squelch from one would be passed into the repeater controller, and that would do the logic and rebroadcast it with a call sign or whatever if necessary, and a delay. So that was the GR500 repeater. All of these radios had this accessory port on the back. Actually, the one that's passing around at the moment, you'll be able to see that on the back. It's this 16-way type edge connector, and that had a number of useful functions on there. So there's an external speaker, microphone audio in, PTT. There's some programmable inputs as well, so we could a programmable input and output. So we could do things like having the squelch, brought out on one of these pins, and that in turn could be made active low or active high. So the sort of thing you could do with it is take, if we program the, see which number is it, 12, yeah, programmable IO2 on pin 12. If we make that active low for squelch, we can wire that straight into the PTT on another radio. We've got a simple repeater. We take the, where's the audio? I think 11, yeah, receive audio out is on 11. We take that into pin 2, which is our mic audio in. We've got the PTT, 7 and 7 of the earth, and that's it, that's all you need, 3 wires, and you've got a very simple repeater. We could improve on that with a monostable timer, just to give a brief delay before it drops carrier, but it could be as simple as that. The other things we could do with it, you've got three bits that you could program, so you could select one of 8 channels effectively by using the 3 programmable inputs for channel selection. There's also an auto on with car ignition, so in that case we take the 12 volt supply to the car battery, but we take the 12 volts when the car's on, the ignition if you like, to the ignition input, which was which one it was now, I think it's one of the programmable, ignition control pin 10, and that way turn the car on, the radio comes on, there's nothing you can do about it. Turn the car off, radio switches off, so there's no excuse about, oh I forgot to turn the radio on, I missed your call. There's a slightly more complicated repeater. Who remembers MB7IBK? It's been a few years now. This was the 2 meter FM to DMR gateway, which was at my house for about a year. And that was a DMR 3400. This device here is a simple UHF DMR radio, and a GM350 2 meter analog radio. So that one's the analog radio, that one's the digital radio, and again this is actually built into a GR500 repeater case, so we were using the Motorola power supply, and that was all controlled with an Arduino. Probably looks more complicated than it really is, but what we were doing on the digital radio, we were taking the torque group select, which is kind of like a squelch, but it only activates when the torque group is active, and we were using that to drive the PTT on the analog radio. So effectively, if anything came in on the torque group, it would activate the 2 meter radio. Likewise, if anything came in on the analog radio, activated the squelch, including CTSSS, because you had to have the CTCSS on to activate the squelch. That would couple back and key up the 70 SEMS radio. So that's how it worked basically. If you want to do something far more complicated with GM350s, if you look at Ragcom a couple of years back, August 2021, M0GUY wrote an article on how to make a full duplex DMR repeater with a couple of GM350s, and you might say, but hang on, a GM350 is only analog, you told us that earlier, Mike. It is, but because you've got access to the discriminator output, the flat audio and flat audio input, it will handle the C4 FM signal, digital signal, which you can then interpret with MMDVM repeater board. So yes, it's an analog only radio, but because you've got access to the discriminator output, you can actually do digital with it if you've got the right extra bits. So that's the result, GV7GP. It's near High Wycombe. Unfortunately I can't hear it from my house, there's no path between Bracknell and Tyler's Green. There is to certain parts of High Wycombe, but it's the wrong side of High Wycombe. And as you can see there's your input and output frequencies. He's got a Raspberry Pi and the MMDVM repeater board all built in again to what looks like a GR500 case. Portable radios. The GP300, pass that one round. There we go. That's a GP300. That's a high band 2 metre one. So there were VHF high 146 to 174. Okay, you say 146. That means you can't use it on 2 metres. You actually can, but you have to trick it into doing it. And there was a software trick you could do with the programming software. And most of them then would actually, the synthesizers would actually work on 2 metres, and they were reasonably sensitive, even though it was out of the band. Unfortunately, I've only ever seen the UHF versions between 438 and 470. They had 2 separate bands for UHF, and I tried programming them on 70, but what I ended up with was something where the squelch needed about neg 90 dBm before it even opened. So it was never going to work, I'm afraid, even though the synthesizer appeared to be happy enough. It just wasn't going through the front end filters. So I'd avoid the UHF version, but the VHF high band, no problem at all. And these come in 2, 4, 8 and 16 channel versions. That one that's going around is a 16 channel one. This is that's an 8 channel one. This is the 16 channel one. I'll pass that around on as well. So again, if you see them, look at the number of channels. Obviously the 2 and 4 channels aren't a lot of use, but 8 and 16, okay, they're useful enough for 2 meters. VHF ones, 5 watts out and 4 watts on UHF. That's the charging base, and that's got an input for 12 volts DC on the back. Perhaps more useful for UHF is the GP340, which is this device here. That one's on 70 SEMS.
Oh, that's heavy, isn't it? That's heavy.
Yeah, they are. They're very solid radios. Just to give you an idea, this is a GM350 that I dismantled. Don't worry, it was a faulty one, so I don't normally rip radios to pieces for the fun of it, but as it was already faulty, yeah, all right, I do, yeah, okay. The radio is all on one PCB, all right? The rest of it is all heatsink. You can see how solidly built they are. I'll pass those around.
Look at that. Yeah.
Probably don't want to touch that white sticky stuff. That's the heatsink compound.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're very well built, and I've never taken apart a handheld, but I can imagine they're probably similar construction. So it's the GP340. GP320 is a single channel, so probably best avoided. GP340, if you find them, they're 16 channels, and they're VHF high or UHF. Unfortunately, the UHF version is wideband, 403 to 470, so it'll do 70 SEMS, and they work quite well. And that's 5 watts out. And just to be awkward, the base is not compatible with the previous ones, so yeah, 2 different bases. And the batteries aren't compatible either. Finally, the GP360. I've never seen one of these, but it's basically a GP340, but with a display and more channels. So you've got this digital display. You've got 255 channels to play with, and optionally they had a CTCSS keypad as well. Unfortunately, I've never seen one, but they do exist. They are out there. All of the radios use the same antenna connections, screw thread. So these are both UHF. That's a helical for UHF. That's a quarter wave for UHF. And those are helicals on the VHF handles going around. So you see a sort of screw thread connector. Yeah. And if you wanted to connect them to an external antenna, this device was available. I've never got my head around this, because if you think about it, if you look at it, the screw thread bit, which was the the live bit of the antenna is actually connected to the outer of the BNC, and the centre pin, which is the earth of the radio, is actually connected to the centre pin of the BNC. I've struggled with that, but it does seem to work.
Oh, dear me.
Yeah. I guess if it's a handheld radio in a plastic case, it probably doesn't make any difference. But I've always been puzzled by that.
Perhaps it's actually using the case.
Yeah. Well, you saw they're very solid aluminium construction, so I suppose if you're holding it in your hand, then you are the earth by capacity. But if you're using it with an external antenna, presumably you're not holding it. Right, so batteries readily available on eBay. Not cheap. Motorola battery will cost you as much as one of the Baofeng radios complete with a battery. But they are far superior radios, of course. Chargers, again, readily available on eBay if you don't get it with the radio. There are singles like you see being passed around, and there are these multiple chargers as well. How are we doing for time? Quarter to. I'm going to finish early, aren't I?
It's all right, we can go.
Okay, carry on doing the sale out there. This is very important. Every radio will have a model number. Let's give you an example. Yeah, if you can see that, it's M08KHE4AA2AN on that particular one. This is, when you see one on eBay that's advertised as just GM350, ask the seller to tell you that number, and you'll be able to figure out what band it's on, how many channels it's got from that. So for the GM350, the fourth character is F for low band, so that's your 4 metre radio, K for high band, so that's your 2 metre radio, and R for UHF for 70 SEMS. The sixth character, E, is the 4 channel version, F is the 128 channel version, and then finally 4 or 6 is either 12.5 or 25 kilohertz channel spacing. So that's the GM350. GM340, GM360, GM380, I've never seen a low band one. I would imagine if you see one and you've got an F in it, then it's a low band one, but I've never seen one. K is high band VHF, R is UHF, and then C is the 4 channel no display, so the GM340, and then F or N is the GM360 and GM380, the 255 channel LCD display radios. For the handhelds, the GP340, 40 and 60, again K for VHF, R for UHF, and you'll find that if you remove the battery, there's a label underneath the battery on the body of the radio. That's where you need to tell the seller to look for the part number. You've got a 1 watt radio for ATEX, so these were used aboard oil rigs. Like, they're intrinsically safe, so you could use them in a sort of gaseous atmosphere. You wouldn't want to use a 5 watt radio if there's a vapour around. They were probably less safe. C is the GP320 or GP340, F is the GP360, and 4, 6, 12.5, 25 all programmable channel spacing. And the GP300, it's a bit more complicated. There was a 1 watt version or a 5 watt. These are 5 watts that are kicking around here, so they would be a figure 9 there. 3 was VHF, but as I said there, 146 to 174, but they could be cheated to work down to 2 meters. And 4 is the UHF version, which I'd say is best avoided because they're deaf if you put them on 70 SEMS. And again, you've got the 12.5 or 25 kilohertz channel spacing. Some of them had CT, CSS and DPL, that's digital selective calling on them. And the 9 was 5-tone selective calling. Again, avoid that because you won't be able to use repeaters with that. It doesn't have CT, CSS. And then A was 2-channel, C was 16-channel and D was 8 channels. I'm going to share the PowerPoint of this with Steve afterwards, so you don't need to be making notes of these. Programming software, unfortunately all of the ones I've talked about so far were DOS based and needed a proper serial RS-232 interface. It does work under Windows XP, fortunately. I've still got a Windows XP computer with a real serial interface. Don't use a USB serial adapter because they might brick the radio, and it probably won't work anyway if you try it. I've got the software for all the radios I've discussed up until now, and I can program them if you do get stuck and you buy one of these.
For a small fee.
No. Well, a contribution to club funds, let's put it that way. The GM340, 350, 360 and 380, the mobiles, all programmed via the RJ45 socket on the front. I've got the cable for that. The GP300 was a bit weird, the handheld radio. You pull off the battery and you've got this device that's kind of like a battery. You plug that in and it's got some extra pins that are a serial interface. So you've got this device that looks like a battery and it's got cables coming out with an RS-232 connector and 12 volt power supply connector to replace what the battery did effectively. But yeah, I can do that. I've got one of those. And the GP340 and 360 were programmed via a cable that connected where the headset goes. So I've got one of those as well. Just to take you through what the software, it wasn't very friendly software by the way, but it did everything you could possibly want. So if we just look at the GM350 software, there was a per radio page, and this was sort of global to everything about the radio. So this bunch of pull downs here determined what the function keys did on the front panel. For example, the loudspeaker was monitor. If you press and hold that, it defeats the squelch, so you just get the white noise. All the others are disabled, but you could get them to do various different things like scanning, like reverting to a preset channel, that kind of thing. You had 2 programmable power levels globally, power 1 and power 2, and that could be anything from 5 up to 25 watts in 1 watt steps. And then when we go into the actual channel pages, you then select whether it's the high power or the low power you're using on that particular channel. Transmit timeout, disable that, it's a pain, you don't want it. And you might possibly have heard me in the early days with these radios on the club net, and I'll disappear after 3 minutes because the default was 180 seconds. So if you set it to 0, it disables it. You can also determine what channel it powers up on when you switch it on. So whatever channel you determine to be, for example, 145.5, put that in there. When you switch it on, it comes up on 145.5 or 145.375 if you want it on the club frequency. That's the per channel page. So you've got up to 128 channels in the case of the display radio. There's your transmit frequency, there's your receive frequency. Didn't have to be related in any way as long as they were on the same band. You could have any split you wanted in there. You could have either no CT CSS or digital CT CSS or analog CT CSS on a per channel basis. And likewise, if we disabled it on receive, it would just be carrier squelch, or we could have digital squelch or digital CT CSS squelch, again on a per channel basis. There's your timeout timer. As I said, disable it, you don't want it. Then you had scan lists. Remember I said there were 6 programmable keys? You could have, one could be a scan A, one could be a scan B. Each scan list could have up to 16 channels. If we put those channels in here, that's what's scanned if we press the scan A button. That's what's scanned if we press the scan B button. And then the GPIO lines. These were the programmable input and outputs, if you remember. So PTT, for example, we could have squelch on one of them, and it could be either active low, active high. And we could also determine how the receive audio output worked on that output connector. We could have filtered or flat. And if you want to do things with C4FM to run it from a MMDVM board, select flat unsquelched, or indeed for 9600 packet radio, set it for flat. But for normal voice, use the filtered, and it would do the de-emphasis on the receive signal. Programming cables, again readily available on eBay. There's one for the GM300. You can see it's a DB9 because it's proper serial, not USB, to an RJ45. That's the device I was talking about for the handheld radio. So that's for the GP300. And you see there you've got this sort of battery eliminator device, and there's our that red and black cable is where we put the 12 volts in, and there's our serial. This one's also got the connector for the GP340 as well, so it could do all of those. These are the ones I think you should avoid, because I think I've got the right software and cables, but I've never been able to get them to work, and I think it's because the software just doesn't like Windows. It is proper DOS software. GM300, GM900 and GM950. I've got a 300 and a 950 at home, sat doing nothing because I can't program them. I don't feel too bad though, because I didn't pay much for them. The next generation of radios are the ones you see here. These are DMR and analog radios, so I'll pass these around. I won't pull that out, I'll pull them on there. So that's the DM3400.
What's it lumpy?
They're heavy. Well, you've seen it, it's all heatsink. That's the DM360. Very similar. One doesn't have an LCD display though, and it's just 32 channels. The other one has an LCD display and it's got thousands of channels. There we are. These are both available on VHF and UHF. In my opinion, I think possibly Colin disagrees with this, but I don't think they're very good DMR radios. The reason is they're meant for commercial use. So they really don't do everything you would need in an amateur DMR radio. Having said that, they are really good analog radios. So yeah, recommend them. If you see them cheap enough and you only want it for analog, they're great. Or if you just want to use it with your hotspot and DMR and you're happy with the not being able to do some of the features of DMR, then again, they're fine.
I use mine with BK, really, GB7 BK.
It's ideal for that.
It seems to work.
Yeah. Yeah, if you only want it for one repeater, and you're happy with not having all of the features you might get from the Anytone radios, then they're okay.
Oh yeah, no, it doesn't match that at all.
No, the Anytone's far better, because the Anytone, of course, is 2 meters and 70 sems.
Yes.
These are 2 meters or 70 sems, depending on which model you buy. So that's the next generation. And I think, yeah, that's it. Any questions?
Could you do all that again, please?
Yeah, we got time. I could. Yeah, so it's been recorded, so it'll be on the YouTube channel. And as I said, I'll share the PowerPoint with Steve. And if anybody else wants a PowerPoint, just drop me a line and I'll email it to you. It's about 10 megs. So, right. If anybody wants to come and have a play, I'll leave them out.
Very good. Very much.